Professor Gesine Schwan is the chair of the Social Democrats Committee on Party Principles and one of the party's pioneering thinkers. Today I'm talking to her about the future of Germany's oldest political party, the SPD. Welcome to the DW interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor Schwan, does the SPD have a future?
Of course. We bear a great responsibility, and responsibility always has a future.
Voters see things differently. The SPD has continued to lose electoral support. It won just 20.5% in the September election and is faring even worse in the polls. 80% of the voters see no future and no residence in the SPD. Are these findings correct?
Of course, they're empirical findings. And parties elsewhere in Europe are doing even worse. It's due to the huge changes in global political problems, social problems which are very hard to quantify politically. Basically, it's about the people represented by the Social Democrats and who have an interest in social democracy. And they've suffered in particular from the global economic developments of the last 30 years. There are no easy answers to this situation.
Indeed, the SPD is in search of new answers and is now making a fresh start with some new faces in the third Grand Coalition. Do they also represent new policies?
Primarily, they represent the policies as agreed on in the coalition deal. But I certainly think they can bring in new ideas and impetus. The big question is whether and to what extent the SPD can meet expectations on tackling issues about the future. And there are crucial points everywhere. I'm very pleased with our new Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas. He's already made it clear to President Macron of France that Germany wants to be accommodating to France and work together with France and other European countries. That's a big step.
You mentioned Heiko Maas, the new foreign minister. He was the Minister of Justice in the previous government, so not such a new face. Do you see fresh impetus from the new ministers? Could any of them be a match for Angela Merkel and be chancellor material?
They're all a match for Angela Merkel because her arguments aren't that strong. They just have to stand up to her, which is a major difference from 4 years ago. Back then, everyone, including the Social Democrats, was afraid of Merkel's popularity. People now realize this was a mistake and that they have to show their independence and display it in public.
In the September election, the SPD and the Conservatives comprising the Grand Coalition were punished at the polls, also due to refugee policy. What went wrong?
We have to understand that the refugees came to Europe at a time when huge discrepancies had been building up for years within Western societies. So it's not the refugees who caused the problems. The problems had been there much longer. The refugees highlighted how many people had been left by the wayside in Western societies. And of course those people will react. What we need are constructive solutions at the local government level, and not cheap anti-refugee talk. Integration has to mean the total integration of society. It's not just about integrating refugees.
Was a mistake also made in losing control? Many people did not understand that.
The mistake was made much earlier. The Chancellor had no concept of a refugee policy. The SPD did not excel here either. Then the borders were suddenly opened without controls. I don't think it was wrong that she opened them in that particular moment, but she had no long-term strategy.
But neither did the SPD.
No, not at first. It took time. You have to understand that a great deal of hardship accumulated over many years in our societies, although we're considered rich. Our societies are very unequal. So it's not difficult to understand it analytically. We have to accept the consequences and build housing for people on long waiting lists and for migrants coming to us. Sure, people who have been waiting for years for social housing are annoyed that refugee shelters are suddenly being built. Both the SPD and the Conservatives failed to see the divides in our society.
And across Europe?
Yes.
There's not so much solidarity as people expect. Poland, for example, doesn't want to take in Muslim refugees. You know Poland and its people well. You speak Polish and did your PhD about the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski. What's your take? Are the Catholic Poles heartless because they refuse to accept a single Muslim refugee?
Absolutely not. Poland is a good example of a country where you cannot equate government with society.
But the government has a two-thirds majority.
Yes, and there are still about 11 major Polish cities whose mayors openly say that they want to take in refugees. The president of the Catholic Bishops' Conference has called the country's behavior towards refugees unacceptable. A Dominican clergyman, the government, and this Catholic manipulation of Radio Maria is destroying Christianity in Poland. Poland is a pluralistic society like many others, and Europe has to support those who want to take in refugees in a direct and intelligent manner. The Law and Justice Party has a majority because they distribute social benefits, for one thing.
But Poles give them majority support on refugees.
Yes, because they now have a monopoly and there are no constructive alternatives coming from Europe. We have to be smarter and be supportive, not judgmental. That's the watchword.
What should the German foreign minister and finance minister, both Social Democrats, do in Brussels? Should they say nations refusing to take in refugees or show solidarity will get no funds from Brussels?
Here I have a clear suggestion. The two ministers should start an initiative with France and the European Council and say, your governments do not have to take in refugees, but you have to agree to a fund that towns and cities across the EU can apply for if they wish to take in refugees. They will be rewarded with development funds. And the states only have to agree to accept the refugees that local authorities want to take in. This will change the situation a great deal, also in Central Europe.
That's a proposal you've developed.
Preliminary decisions have already been made. Just this week, the EU Parliament's Budgetary Committee gave the go-ahead.
But with all due respect, that sounds very idealistic. Your mother once said that idealism does not always lead to success. Is that still true?
I can't say whether my mother would have been successful, but it isn't idealistic at all. It's totally well-founded. There was cross-party support in the European Parliament for such a fund. Now the governments just have to be smart enough to say, we will give the local authorities the chance that wherever integration is happening, people there can also be involved. That's another requirement, that the business community, organized civic society, and local governments should pave the way for integration, set the figures. And if this happens voluntarily, the situation looks quite different.
Your work in promoting relations between Germans and Poles was a factor in the SPD twice nominating you as their candidate for the German presidency. You lost the vote both times. Which of the two defeats was worse?
The second defeat was pretty bitter, because I had campaigned for a year. The first defeat, or rather my nomination, came out of the blue, so I wasn't really...
Prepared?
Sure, I was prepared. Everyone was pleasantly surprised that I could string 3 sentences together when speaking in public. As for the second defeat, I didn't take it as a personal defeat. It's just the way majorities work. During the year when I was running for president, the majorities developed in a different direction than the one I'd been hoping for. I still learned an enormous amount, and I think I was in a better position to influence the public agenda, which I still do today. And that's an advantage.
With your second nomination, you would have achieved a majority together with the Greens and the Left Party. Should the SPD consider the Left Party as an option at the national level so that you could put forward a candidate for chancellor?
It is the only realistic model, and I've been advocating it for years. I also believe that in terms of fundamental approach, it works with these 3 parties. The Left Party sometimes has internal divisions, as in all parties. The Christian Democrats, too. In my view, this is the option that needs working on. I also believe it best represents a Europe of solidarity. Once again, it's clear that our conservatives have no intention of responding to Macron.
But the SPD leadership is reluctant to commit to the Left Party, as the conservatives would accuse them of aligning themselves with former communists.
They were too intimidated. Looking back on my second nomination, it's clear that the SPD leadership under Franz Müntefering was too wary. I was nominated by a majority formed by the SPD, the Left, and the Green Party, and should have been elected by them too. It's a shame. The problems are elsewhere today, not who the old communists are. We have globalization problems, we have poverty and climate change, we have a constructive approach to the refugee question.
You're saying it's time.
These are all quite different problems. We can't get caught up in nostalgic problems. That's nonsense.
I understand. It's time, and I'm afraid it will shortly be time to end our interview. I'd like you to complete 3 sentences that I will start off for you. For the future of the SPD, I hope
that it finds the courage to draw up a clear vision of its tasks and to implement them.
I wish I had been elected as Germany's president because
I'd like to have addressed the difficult issues facing Germany, because it's easier for our president to do this than for an elected politician.
I'm not a professional politician, you once said, but
I've always been politically active. I see this as a mark of a person's character, just like Hannah Arendt.
Gesine Schwan, thank you for talking to us.